Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and thanks for your patience. We were just making sure that everything was set up on our end and that we don't, miss any of the beautiful things that our panelists say. So welcome to Reimagining Philanthropy. This is our second session and we're really excited to be here with you all. When I can see that page, if you can bring it down so we can see the slides, thank you. So we had our first session a couple months ago, and I'm really excited that some of you are able to join again. And I know that we had a lot of folks who weren't able to attend live, but who are really looking forward to the recording. So if you're watching this after the fact, thank you so much for watching. My name is Aisha. I'm the Donor Relations Manager here at Powerful Voices. Next month is actually my 1-year anniversary since I started working here. So that's very exciting. And I also can't believe how much time has passed so quickly. So Reimagining Philanthropy, like I said, this is our second session, and this is the BIPOC Fundraisers Roundtable. So it's kind of misleading because not all of our panelists are direct fundraisers, but we thought it was snappy. So really, it's just about looking at and investigating what equity and social justice look like in philanthropy. And we invited the folks on this panel today to join because I know personally that they're all amazing people and also that they bring such perspective to the work that they do. And so I'm really excited that they agreed to join, that we're gonna have them here today. So as always, you can feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. We might have time for some other questions at the end, but if we don't, just please do still send them in and we'll try to get to them. If not in this session, then we'll try to get to them at the next. I know like at our last session, there were a lot of conversations about donor advised funds and wealth hoarding and things like that. And so the speakers will talk a little bit to those topics just to address some of those questions. So if you ever have a question, let us know and we'll try to address it. If not now, then in a future session. So I'm gonna get started with just reading off everyone's bio at once. And then we'll start with a round of check-in questions. And then we'll get into those hard-hitting questions. And we'll be going in alphabetical order, so you'll see kind of a pattern, but it's gonna be very exciting. So to start off with our first panelist, Erika. Erika is a consultant focused on racial equity with nonprofit operations, fundraising, and organizational culture, with an emphasis on inclusion and employee happiness. She is a founding member of the community-centric fundraising movement. She also volunteers her time at the appeals chair for the Seattle Human Rights Commission and as vice president of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access for AFP Advancement Northwest. Hi, Erika. We're excited that you're here. Then we have Mano. Mano is the donor organizing manager at Social Justice Fund. He immigrated to the US as an Angolan refugee at age 6. He grew up in St. Louis and moved to Seattle in 2008. In 2014, Mano connected with Social Justice Fund as a practicum student and giving project participant. For over 5 years, he's been a fundraiser working to build strategies for raising and moving resources to BIPOC communities that challenge anti-Black and white supremacist norms in the field. Hi, Mano, very excited that you joined us today. Then we have Maris, who was born and raised in Seattle. Maris graduated from Whitman College with a bachelor's degree in French and economics. I did not notice that before. French and economics. Oh my gosh, so swanky. Okay, in the year since graduating, she's primarily worked in youth development in South Seattle with Refugee Women's Alliance and Seattle Housing Authority. Her broad experience with nonprofits also includes grant writing, fundraising, and participating in United Way's board training program project lead. Thank you so much for being here. We're very, very excited. And then Silvia. Silvia has developed an extensive background in relationship management and strategic communications. As a first-generation American, Silvia is passionate about working with communities through grassroots engagement to organize for equality. She received her undergraduate degree in social science from the University of Washington and a master's degree in global communications from the American University of Paris. She has worked in the nonprofit, government, and private sector, creating outreach, communication, and social media plans. And Silvia was once my boss. So she has some things I'm sure she could say, but we'll ask her to refrain from those. And actually, before we jump into the check-in question, I did want to do Powerful Voices, Land, and People Acknowledgement, and then we'll transition into our questions. So we acknowledge that we gather on land that was stolen from the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, who are the true stewards of this land. We acknowledge the sacrifices of Indigenous Africans whose stolen labor was used to work this land. And we acknowledge immigrant communities whose contributions continue to deepen and diversify the cultural fabric of the nation that occupies this land. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, especially a big shout out to our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. So like we talked about, going in alphabetical order, Erika, if you would start us off with, what is a show that you're watching right now that you're really loving?
I would love to, thank you. I am watching the show Warrior on HBO Max. I'm midway through season 2, and if you haven't heard of it, it's set in the 1800s in San Francisco's Chinatown during like the Tang Wars. It's very violent, but it's also just very great, the whole plot lines. And it touches on philanthropy, so shout out there.
It all connects, even in our TV watching, it's all aligned. Mano, if you'd like to go next.
This isn't as cool. I've been watching The Nanny, also on HBO Max. It can be really problematic, but I don't know. I'm kind of hooked.
I love that, and it's so random because I'm planning to start watching The Nanny very soon. Like, I'm working my way through like classic comedy shows. So again, alignment, not in the same cool way like you mentioned, but in a way. Mars, do you want to go?
I'm laughing because I'm also watching The Nanny. I'm right there with you, Mano. But just for variety's sake, I've really been loving the Marvel shows that have been coming out. So I watched WandaVision, which was not like a Marvel movie in a way. It just had so many layers to it around love and grief. And I'm aware that Marvel is military propaganda, but I also can't help that. I want some action and adventure to watch sometimes. So great show.
Yeah, Silvia.
Yeah, same, Morris, same. I've been into the Marvel universe, like WandaVision. We just started Loki last night, so it's hard to not be a part of that world, but enjoying it. And then I also just finished the last season of Master of None with Lena Waithe, which is really good. And so yeah, just excited about all of that.
Yeah, Sylvia and I were texting last night about the Loki show, so I knew she would mention that. Also, I just feel like there might be some concentric circles around like philanthropy people and The Nanny. I don't know. There might be some studies that need to be done there. Thank you all so much for our little check-in question. We just like to break the ice, you know, see a little personality. So we'll start off with our first question, and we'll go to you, Erika, and then if you can pass it on to Mano, you can pass it on to Maris, and then Maris to Sylvia. But if there's any confusion, of course, I will be here and I'll jump in. So starting off, we know that development and philanthropy are primarily white spaces. How did you come to be in this work, and where do you work, and what do you do? So I'll pass to you, Erika.
Thank you. Okay, how far back do I go? I think, I fell into this work. It wasn't intentional or on purpose. And I think that's when I talk to fundraisers, it's usually the case. It's only now just starting to be something people study and like actually intend on doing for work, only more recently, I think. So for me, let's see, I started out in high school working at Office Max, and I was a really good salesperson. I sold like the extra protection when you bought like a printer or something. And I just like always kind of connected to that selling aspect and the aspect of like connecting with customers and kind of building that relationship. I worked in retail, I worked in restaurants, and always really liked that kind of like one-on-one time. So after I graduated college, I found I studied business undergrad. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to help people. I think that's also like a trauma response. We don't have time to get into that, but both of my parents came from working in the public sector, social work, and paramedic side of things. So I knew I wanted to help people. So I found this company that did fundraising. There's actually a for-profit fundraising company. They sold fundraisers. It was like free, but the company got a percentage of what was raised by schools and nonprofits. So I worked there for almost 4 years, ended up being a manager, and like really loved connecting with schools and sports teams and groups that needed to raise money. And I really liked hearing about what their needs were and what their values were, and like trying to help them meet those goals. But I definitely realized working in the for-profit sector, even for a company that said it was mission driven, I definitely noticed the tension between the profit driving, the bottom line, and what the mission work was. And that workplace was just also really toxic. So I decided I wanted to switch and be like, I want to stay with fundraising, but I want to go to the nonprofit side. I thought that would like fix everything. Spoiler alert, it did not. When I went to grad school, one of my professors, I'll always remember this, said that nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. And I definitely have noticed that now working for nonprofits. We're still profit seeking. We still need to survive and sustain. And there's still that tension between mission and fundraising and needing the money. So that's kind of the long, short version of where I am now, which I co-founded the community-centric fundraising movement. We're trying to change the way fundraising is done. And I'm also an independent consultant, mostly focused on organizational culture, which is like I've come from both for-profit and nonprofit, really terrible work culture environments. And I'm trying to change that in the sector as well. So I will pass it on to Manu.
Yeah, I came to this from a organizing background. I was a student organizer when I was in the School of Social Work. And I was also going through a program where I became disillusioned with the nonprofit system and how it sort of cycles through like how it's connected to wealth and how it doesn't really get past what like donors want. It's just sort of a band-aid, and it's not. It kind of becomes really weighed down by huge money and resources. I was also like a book that talks a lot about it is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. I was reading that, and so I was like an angsty, like 30-year-old being like, man, the system's messed up. And then people were just like, yeah. Also, you know, there's groups doing radical work and also moving money and keeping stuff going. And so why don't you go look for that? And so then I got connected with SJF. I was still really pretty skeptical. And then I did a giving project with them. I also did my practicum with them. And I recognized the capacity for when we change the way that people relate to money and relate with each other and relate with how they view their connection like with money. It's like so that they don't believe it's their money. It's like stolen money historically, and you can move people to change how they move their money and move their resources. You make it a lot easier for the radical organizations to stay radical and not just continue moving, like just not continue doing things the way that mainstream organizations want that to happen. And so that's kind of my initial origin story. And so I carried that on to trying to work within, trying to be a fundraiser, because I realized that it's not only important that organizations have are doing radical work, but the money that's coming into those organizations need to be flowing. It doesn't, without any like restrictions and issues. And so I wanted to go into fundraising to figure out ways of fundraising and building resources, especially within BIPOC-led organizations that are that are at the same level as mostly white-led organizations. And it's hard. It's been difficult, but I'm at a place now at SJF where we're like, oh, this makes sense. This is working. It's like in line with our values, and we're seeing the impacts of what we're doing. So, yeah. Maris?
Like looking over here because I'm such a visual person, I have to see the question again. Yeah, so how I came into this work, as Aisha mentioned, I was doing youth development work in Seattle. I became very frustrated just seeing a little bit of what Mano was talking about, like the difference in how white-led mainstream orgs were getting funded versus POC-led orgs doing development work with mostly BIPOC kids. So then out of that frustration, I started applying to jobs. I met with this woman who was actually on the board of the org that I currently work with. And she was like, maybe you should apply to this job. And so I say that because I don't think if I'd made that personal connection with her, I actually would have gotten this job. And I think it just goes to show, in the hiring process, who gets weeded out and who doesn't. And just the fact that it was another Black woman with similar values to mine who was able to make that connection for the job that I currently have. And the work that I do, so I work at Philanthropy Northwest. So technically, as I said, I'm not a fundraiser. I work with foundations and grant makers in Washington and other states where we work in a 6-state region, but we're based in Seattle and we do a lot of trainings with them. So I'll leave it at that. Silvia, I think you're next.
Yeah. I started my career in politics. We can go back to TV shows. I loved West Wing and was like, I want to get into politics. And as I started that route, I realized kind of what Mano and Erika and Maris have all talked about, this idea of the strings attached when you fundraise. And also the other problem with politics is you have to ask people for their time, which I think if people are stingy with money, they're worse with time. And so it became very double nature for me to do those things. And I liked it, I enjoyed it, but it just didn't feel like the right fit for me. So then I moved on to the nonprofit world. And I noticed the tie between communication and fundraising. And I really loved that idea of, and still continue to love how if you make it simple and you make the words simple, people really can jump on board and really see what it is. And so I went back to school for communications because of that reason. And then I started doing jobs with communication focus and volunteer focus. And then I got this opportunity at Young Women Empowered, which is where I work now as the Director of Development and Communications. And it really fit kind of what everyone has also talked about, this idea of really being an org that talks about and does the work as they're talking about it, and how important that is for me as we're going through all of this. And so, yeah, it's been an amazing opportunity and I've really enjoyed it. And I've been following everyone on this panels. Community-centric fundraising has been a big part. Mano and I have had conversations about this, about really how do we get the strings cut to be able to really fundraise and say, we're doing the work, give us that money so that we can continue to do the work. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. And I think for me, I can't help but notice that I think everyone kind of said like you happened into this work, which I think is very common for a lot of fundraisers, but especially for BIPOC fundraisers and philanthropy workers. It's not usually a career path that we have planned out, but because of these, relationships we have with different organizations, with different people, we get into it. And I think that is also the kind of foundation of BIPOC fundraising, is those relationships, and that when, you know, we kind of are in touch with different folks, amazing things can happen. So thank you so much, everyone, and welcome, now that you've all introduced yourselves more formally. So we'll jump into the second question. And also, before we get into this question, I want to say that if any point you would like us to come back to you, just let me know, and we'll circle back. And at the end, I'll ask if anyone has any follow-up points that you want to make to a different panelist, just so that everyone watching is aware that that is all planned and intentional. So our second question is, in our last session, like I mentioned, we spoke a lot about wealth hoarding and philanthropy. Do you see this as being a cause of concern in your work, or what's your framework around this? And so Erika, if you're ready, I'll pass to you.
Well, am I ready? That's a different question, but thank you. Yes, definitely I see that wealth hoarding and philanthropy. I see that as a cause for concern. I think just connecting this a little bit back to what you were just saying too, Aisha, around how a lot of us have happened into this work. And I think especially as BIPOC fundraisers, what I feel like I noticed, at least for myself, was that if you're someone who's committed to social justice and like making change in the world, and you want to change where the power is, I think that's where we then end up realizing that money is so connected to that, right? Money and power are so interconnected, and that's where philanthropy and wealth hoarding also intersect, right? There's, I think, also in our culture as a whole, American culture, I would say, I don't think it's like this in all parts of the world, but we have such a scarcity mindset, and we have this culture of not wanting to pay taxes. Like everybody has this thing around like trying to hoard your money and like not paying taxes, not trusting the government to do what's right with it. And I think that scarcity and that culture around not wanting to pay taxes, that leads to this like hoarding, and has completely led to this whole philanthropic sector, right? In like the 1800s, that's when people were trying to get around paying their taxes and putting them in these tax shelters. And then how today we have donor advised funds being the newest fad of that. So I definitely see that as a big concern, because where the money is being hoarded, power is being hoarded, white supremacy is being upheld, and we need to transfer that. My framework around this is definitely trying to encourage people to think about, especially white folks, to think about where their money came from, what the origins of that, how they got it, and I want to push for foundations to, the minimum payout is 5% per year. And I want to, I think there's a big push already in the sector to get that to be 10%. My thing is like, if a foundation wants to ask me what they should do, I say sunset. Make your plan to give away all that money. And that would be radical, I think. I feel like I could talk about this more, but I want to invite Manu to join in.
Yeah, all that sounds right. And, I think that on the question about like wealth hoarding and philanthropy, like I also think that in indigenous communities and like other BIPOC communities have been doing philanthropy and sharing resources, and just the idea of what philanthropy is, what resources is, what money is, has been so collapsed in a way that it makes it so that it's defined in a way that a lot of BIPOC folks can't be seen as like being full of resources and sharing resources and moving money and time and energy. And that, I think that's like a game that mainstream philanthropy also plays. It's like, we're not the only ones with all of the money. We're not just the ones with all of the money. But because we have all of the money, we also have all of the answers. This is probably something we'll talk more about, which is, extremely frustrating. So I'm mostly interested in deconstructing these ideas of what philanthropy is and how it operates, so that we're not stuck in this way of saying it's not just the money, but like the resources are within our communities, and like it's important to be able to, like, as we're telling people with a lot of privilege and wealth that they need to move that money, give that money away. We also need to undo our own ideas about that we don't have those resources, that we can't move large amounts of money and other kinds of resources that are just equally as valuable. But like specifically about hoarding, I don't think of capitalism as like the way to go. And so I don't think that's your money. Like, I think I am underpaid. I've been underpaid as a human being, and I'm part of the society, and I'm not getting the same kinds of resources as other people living right next to me. I've done amazing work all of my life, but that's like been devalued because it so that other people can get more value for doing work that is deemed better, but I can't get those jobs because there's a lot of systems that allow me not to move in that direction. So I think that it's not anybody's money anyway, historically, currently. So it's not, it's stolen money. It's not hoarded money. It's like, these are resources and things that are stolen from people. And so the right thing to do is not to steal from people, but to share what has been, what's out there already. Maris?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that you all have said. I'll also say with philanthropy, I want to make a distinction between like institutional philanthropy and what I consider to be real philanthropy, because to me, real philanthropy is just what people do when they're not getting a tax break versus what, many richer folks do when they're doing philanthropy, which is, I'm going to donate my money because I want the tax break. I just wanted to make that distinction. And then with the institutions, I think it's a major issue that with philanthropic organizations, they actually have more assets that they're just sitting on than they're actually granting away. So how philanthropic is that? Because their goal is to stay forever. And like Erika said, if folks want to do real work, they can sunset. One thing I'll also say around that, though, is while I agree that folks should be sunsetting and that this money should really be going towards taxes and supporting our communities overall, there are some more conservative philanthropists and philanthropic organizations that are not going to sunset. So how do we balance out, we don't want all the progressive foundations to sunset, and then we're left with the foundations who want to fund racism and sexism and homophobia. So that's one thing that I struggle with. But I'll end there and toss it to Silvia.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has been saying. I think the additional thing for me about all of this is not only the hoarding, which I think we're trying to do a workshop on how do you deal with that trauma. We're working with Nafasi from Narratives Unbound on how do you work through that trauma, but that makes you want to hoard. But I want to say the other part of that as an organization too is the strings that come attached with it, right? I can't, that money can't just go to what as an organization we think it should go. It's this idea of, here's $1,000 and here's 10,000 forms you have to fill out and to prove what you've done and all that stuff. So especially when you're a small org and maybe there's only 2 of you or there's volunteers only, that makes it more difficult in order for the orgs that are really doing the work to be able to get the money. And I think also the other part of that I want to talk about is the fact that this hoarding leads to this continual, cycle of every year orgs having to work to get that little bit of money to be able to continue to work. And so I don't know, for me, that's part of the problem as well. And I definitely think that needs to be acknowledged, that it's not just it's not easy to get the money once it's there. So not only are they hoarding, but you have to jump through 30,000 hurdles in order to get that money. And I think that also adds a lot of stress, especially to BIPOC communities when, you know, maybe when you're a bigger org, you have a staff of 40 and that's not as hard.
Absolutely, to everything everyone said, absolutely. Erika, I wanted to jump to you really quickly because I think you touched on this, but I believe it was you. I remember when we were doing our phone call for this, you were talking about you know, the disbursements that foundations have to do, like the percentage they have to do every year. I think you had mentioned, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, something about how, oh, like, okay, let's say we just increase the amount, but if these foundations are already only giving to white communities, that push doesn't necessarily make sense. Am I correct in remembering you saying a bit about that?
Maybe.
I think that was our call, Aisha.
Look at me confusing the calls, but maybe Erika, you want to give a little touch on that,
Yeah.
or Mars, and then.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely just touched on a little bit on the payout percentage of only 5%. I was going to actually ask Manu because I feel like Social Justice Fund talks a lot about the percentage that's given out to BIPOC communities and to community organizing in general. I think is like smaller than 1% or something. I don't know, Manu, if you know that. But yeah, I'll let anybody else jump in.
Mars, I can answer after Mars goes.
Oh, I guess, yeah, just to expand on that point quickly, I think what I was saying was there is a push for philanthropic institutions to give a higher percentage. 10% has been the number, which, yes, I do want them to give 10%, but right now, many philanthropic organizations are really only giving their money to white-led orgs. And so if them pushing their payout rate to 10%, if they're going to push out their payout rate to 10% right now, that would only just mean they're giving more money to white-led orgs, which I'm not interested in. So I think there's a process of like, first figure out your stuff and have relationships with BIPOC-led orgs or communities or individuals that you can fund, and then, you know, use that extra percentage of money to fund those orgs. Don't push your percentage to 10% just so you can fund the same old. So that was really what we had talked about on the phone. But I think other folks have pretty much touched on that point in different ways.
Yeah, and yeah, Erika, and it's kind of like a little hard to know exactly how much foundations are funding and where they're funding, because those like studies were, yeah, it's extremely vague, but it's definitely like for community organizing, it's probably less than 1%. It's like for BIPOC-led organizations, it's like less than 10%. And then when you look at it closer, you find that Black-led organizations get more strings attached to their work. And it's like, it's just racism in money. Like, you know, we don't trust Black people, so we're going to make sure that you're actually doing what we want you to do because we don't believe in the solutions that you offer. So yeah, it's like all of the race, if we're not like dealing with how racism operates within our society, then, and like all of the other oppressive systems that we're just allowing it to continue through the ways in which we move money.
I'm just going to add, sorry, Aisha, can I? Yeah, I just want to say what Mano said is so relevant and true. And we continue to do that too, because, right, like if you work at a foundation and you're a white-led nonprofit, you probably, the ED has a good relationship with the foundation. So we're continuing this networking of, and again, we're being left out. So systemic racism is constantly the biggest thing that we keep seeing in all of this, is this idea of, and I'm happy it was addressed though, that if you go from 5 to 10%, but you're continuing to fund the same old, you know, then what are you really doing to cause change? So I just think that's important.
No, absolutely. And thank you guys for correcting me there. Y'all, I'm on like half an espresso shot. I'm usually like a 4 to 6 espresso shot kind of girl. So thank you for that. And also, I mean, I think a lot of the conversations we had, there's a lot of similarities in things we're talking about, and also a lot of difference and a lot of different angles. So I appreciate everyone bringing their perspectives to this question. And I will move us along to the next one. which is, I think, Mano, you talked, well, everyone kind of touched on this a little bit about, okay, so we want to have this money so that we can have this impact, have solutions, have change. And so this is kind of getting at some trickiness in that, which is, especially in the last year, I've seen a lot of conversations from activists and community members who believe that nonprofits slow down necessary social justice work by advocating for reforms instead of revolution. Do you think that's true? And you can let me know if you need that clarified in any way, but Erika, I will pass to you first.
Thanks. Yeah, my answer to that is yes, I agree with that. I think I just want to bridge a little bit back to the last question too, or like a little bit of what we were just talking about as far as increasing the payout to then just fund more white-led orgs. And I think that brings us to what Silvia was saying as far as like systemic racism goes. It's also internal in the nonprofit sector, right? BIPOC folks in the nonprofit sector are mostly capped, right? There's still like this ceiling. There's not as much BIPOC leadership. So another thing we can do to change that is to work on our internal cultures at our orgs in our sector so that there's more BIPOC folks in leadership, more honestly, like maybe even get rid of some of those white-led orgs and let communities that are most affected by issues start their own organizations and run them, and they know what they need. So I think that's one of the problems as to like why I believe nonprofits slow down necessary social justice work is the way that nonprofits were founded, the way our entire sector was founded was by philanthropists, wealth hoarding, right? And then having basically like rich white women be like bored. And then they're like, okay, we're just gonna like run these charities and we're gonna help people. So it's still being seen today where the majority of the demographics in nonprofits are white women. And even though those white women are not necessarily like, as far as like the 1800s, like rich white women that don't need to work, there definitely is, nonprofit folks are not paid as well as like for-profit people. So there definitely is some level of that where the people who can afford to work in nonprofits are people that are a little bit more well off financially in our system of capitalism where you need money to survive. And that's the other side that I see of this. And I definitely don't think it's all nonprofits. I definitely think there are nonprofits out there that are and can be radical and be advocating for revolution. But I think for the majority, and I think this is really unconscious for a lot of people in the nonprofit sector, is that they have a vested interest in keeping the nonprofit sector running, right? We live in capitalism, and in order to survive, you need to have a steady income, you need to have a job. And if you actually think about it, if we're calling for a revolution and trying to actually like dismantle the entire system of philanthropy and nonprofits, that would mean that a lot of people would be out of jobs. And that's, I think, kind of subconscious for a lot of people, is that like, we need to just make slow changes so I can stick around and help make those slow changes and continue to get my paycheck and continue to work. And I think that's, there's a real tension there between the reality of existing in capitalism and needing that, but also like, we want to envision a world that's outside of capitalism and outside of this whole structure. So Mano, what do you think?
I wish we were actually at a dinner and like just talking. I could pour you some wine, and Erika, and be like, yeah, totally. But yeah, I think that's, I agree with like 99% of that the nonprofit system is actually a creation of capitalism as a way to like hoard more wealth, and it's not a system to liberate us from ourselves or from like an oppressive society. And at the same time, like I'm like constantly seeing amazing radical work within nonprofits work systems. And I've been in spaces with like radical white people being like, yeah, I don't give to 501c3s because, forget them. And I'm just like, no, but that's a really simplistic way of looking at it. Like, if they are like, femme, Black, and like doing radical work, move money to them. Like, and also don't just give to 501c3s, give to like organizations that are like complex. So I'm always worried about like it's generally true, but then what ends up happening is like, the way that I see some people responding to that is like moving less money instead of increasing the money in which they move when we like frame it in that kind of way. I'm more interested in like I do think that happens. And to move away from like a scarcity mindset and a zero-sum game kind of a framework of it, I think that even though it's true, we need to be really more intentional and nuanced in the ways in which we approach solutions. I was actually I'm part of an I've been part of an organization called Got Green, which is an environmental justice organization, and there's this framework around just transition. So there's this idea that we need to move away from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, and part of that does apply to the ways in which we do resources, and also making sure that we don't throw people away as we're doing that transition, that especially people who are like specifically marginalized. I'm lucky because I can work from home and like during this pandemic, but like these last years like showed how unequal our system is and how like problematic it is. And I want to figure out approaches and solutions that center the people that will be and are most impacted in this economic system. Maris?
Again, agree with everything they said. Just to add on, one thing I think about is, yes, nonprofits definitely slow down social justice work, but what role do like donors and philanthropic organizations have in that? Because I do think folks feel like they have to water down their work in a way just to get funded. And so for folks who are donors or working at philanthropic organizations, you have to really think about, am I funding orgs that only the orgs that I'm comfortable with, or am I actually funding orgs that are doing real revolutionary work? And not just orgs, like Mano said, not just C3s, but C4s, and even just groups of people. Like there's groups of people in every city, in every town that are doing great work. So you don't have to limit yourself to just funding nonprofits. The other thing I'll say is that the same way that we talk about foundations needing to sunset, nonprofits should also be thinking about sunsetting. There are nonprofits who've been around. I'm like, you've been around since 1888. What? What are you doing? What are you doing? And I know that there's been a lot of systems stuff happening that, it's hard to work through, but nonprofits sometimes are like, yeah, in 100 years, this is where we want to be, or 50 years. And I'm like, why are you planning to be around for that long? Are you also planning for like how you want to work towards some systems change so that you don't have to be around? So just, yeah, that point I wanted to say about, we should really also be talking about how can nonprofits sunset as well. And not just the white nonprofits, like all nonprofits really, if we're thinking about real revolution and like a real different world to what we're experiencing today. So, Silvia, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you, Maris. Yeah, I mean, those are all great statements. For me, I think we're, so capitalism is the game we're playing, and, the system is a part of that. And so I think the other side of that is nonprofits and activists. And I do think it's a spectrum of people. And, I think that what activists are important at is to remind us what real revolution and liberation looks like. And I think that sometimes that can mean we can work together, and sometimes that means it's two different things. And maybe the reform that happens, we can celebrate knowing that it's a step along the way to the true liberation. And so I really want to acknowledge that I think we're all key players. And I think, there are some nonprofits that are really not doing the work, but there are a lot of nonprofits, like everyone has said, that are doing the work. And as someone who has a political background, I can also say the reform is the reform because that's what's being put in front of the legislators, right? So like, what is a nonprofit? If you're a 501c4, your options are to see what bills are there and then support whatever moves forward. So again, this is a plug for one of my passions, where it's important for us to vote and make sure that we get the people there that can make that change, so we continue to see that move and activism, and get those people in there more, so that we're all in there fighting for that true liberation.
Thank you, everyone. Before we move on to the next question, I know that this question is particularly complex, and I just want to give a moment if any of the panelists want to respond to something another panelist said, or if you had any thoughts come to you after you spoke. Was there anything else anyone wanted to share?
One last thing I'll say is, and I don't think this is anything, this is something people talk about all the time, I think, but just what services are we putting on nonprofits that our government should actually be providing? Because it's really basic stuff sometimes, and I'm like, why is a nonprofit having to do all this when we have taxes that are going to the government? So yeah.
Listen, I see you're just going to open a can of worms and then walk away. I mean, that's a whole panel by itself of like what work nonprofits are doing that should be government projects. And I will just very briefly say, because I'm not on the panel, but I can't help myself, is that I'm currently doing this research project with NGO, so non-government agency organizations in Haiti. And one of the big things there that activists in Haiti talk about is because nonprofits have taken so much work on that it makes the government unstable, because the government doesn't have projects that it's doing because it's been taken over by these nonprofits. And so it actually a lot of activists in Haiti say it destabilizes their government and makes it impossible for a democracy, because the nonprofits there are taking up so much of the work. And obviously, as we know, like the government and the nonprofit world, they have different fail-safes, they have different stakeholders. So that's all just important to think about. So I'll just give another chance if anyone wanted to say anything, but if not, we'll move on to the next question. Okay. Amazing. Okay, well, thank you everyone for that question. I know it's a hard one, because also I know that all of us work at or have worked at nonprofits or at different foundations. And so I know that question, at least for me, hits home of like, this is the work I do. So I appreciate you all, answering that question and being super thoughtful. So our last question, because we've actually almost been here an hour already, which I can't believe, because I'm just absolutely enraptured by all of our panelists. And I was saying to them earlier, like I wish we could all just be at like dinner and having these conversations, because I just absolutely love what everyone's saying and to hear everyone's frameworks. So it's just super lovely to be here with you all. And our last question, and I know there's some diversity of thought here, is how can philanthropy and development spaces encourage more Black and Brown people to come into the field? Erika, we'll start with you again.
Aisha, you have this like secret knowledge, having talked to us all separately, and you're like, there's this diversity of thought, and I'm like so interested to hear what everyone else is going to say, and I'm already learning from you all too, so it really has been amazing. How can philanthropy development spaces encourage more Black and Brown people to come into the field? Money, pay them, pay them well, pay them really, really well. I think one of the negative things that's already happening, that's currently happening, it's like kind of seen as this positive thing in our sector and in a lot of sectors, for profit as well, that there's this like and I know it's not new, but like a newfound commitment to like diversity, equity, inclusion work. And they're like creating these new positions, you know, like VP of DEI and all these kind of things. But in actuality, I think most of the time, and not all the time, but most of the time they end up being just really performative. Right. And it's just to show that they have hired somebody who's Black or brown or Indigenous, and that they have this title and it sounds like they have a lot of power, when in actuality, those folks are not set up for success. They're not given a budget or resources or like any actual political capital within the organization. And they're just end up being seen as the problem. Like everybody dislikes that person, or they're actually like seen as police in the organization. And so I think changing that dynamic, changing the whole view that like there needs to be like a separate position, not that that's bad, but like setting them up for success, I think is really important. I also think what I try to do in my work in like changing organizational culture is embedding, and I think focusing on the equity inclusion. I think the diversity piece is important, but you can't really do it unless you're more focused on the inclusion and the equity. And so I think it's like embedding those things into everybody's job descriptions, embedding them into what's being evaluated and measured in people's job roles. I think that extends to hiring. When you're hiring for any position, say you're hiring for like a communications person, you want to look at their portfolio and how they what their experience is in communications, but you also want to think about what skills and competencies do they have that are going to create the kind of culture we want in our nonprofit. Do they have lived experiences? Do they have they taken the time to study about systemic racism, history of oppression, capitalistic structure, white supremacist culture? Do they have these actual pieces of knowledge and skills that are going to help make our spaces more welcoming and inclusive to Black and brown folks? And if you're actually like looking for that in hiring, it's going to make it a lot easier once people are part of the team to create that culture and keep folks. It'll like lead to higher retention rates and that sort of thing. And then you have to continue that on as to like when you're doing your annual performance reviews or what you're holding people accountable to on a daily basis. You have to look at the actual what are the actual like actions, the actionable things that people are doing to contribute to an inclusive culture on a daily basis. And you have to measure that and you have to evaluate on that. And you can't just say, great, this person in their fundraising role raised $100,000 this year, check, they're done. It's more like, how did they do it? Were they collaborative with their team, or were they othering? Did they do a bunch of microaggressions? Or like these are the things people need to be evaluated on and like have that understanding from the start that this is what the focus is. Their job is not just fundraising role. Their job is like to be part of this culture that is inclusive and welcoming to Black and brown folks. This is something I could talk about forever, but I would like to invite everybody else. So, Mano.
Yeah, I think it's important to like make sure that the first step is to create a culture that is accepting. And like that's really hard in most of the spaces that I go into. Like there's this immediate sense of I feel uncomfortable around it. And I was just like, you don't even know me. like what are you uncomfortable about? And I get buffeted by that. And these are like hella liberal people. These are people that view themselves as like progressive and have like critical understanding. And so I think that's, for me, really difficult, to like, it's difficult to see a lot of spaces where I feel comfortable having like uh, a lot of Black and brown people going into, especially within philanthropy and development, if it's not already a mostly, you know, BIPOC space or like like it's diverse, because that, you know, when I moved to Seattle, I got schooled on like white liberal racism. I was just like, oh, I didn't understand this before. I thought people were cool, and they're not. they're just better at hiding their oppressive behaviors. And so that's, for me, what's scary about bringing more like Black and brown people into spaces like that, because then you get gaslit, and you think of yourself as like not having the capacity and the skills and the ability to do the work, or you're like just like emotionally just tired and you don't know why. And so then you're not able to do the work. There's all of these little things that happen to Black and brown people in like white spaces that messes you up. And so, yeah, I do think the work has to be done by white people, whiteness in general, to make the spaces better and to make it more accepting of Black and brown folks. And I also don't necessarily think that, you know, mainstream philanthropy and development is like, we need to go into that space. I'm like interested of like how do we make our own spaces? How do we create spaces that are safe for us and like have like a cool white person to tell the other white people what to do. And so then it's like we're not having to compete on the same level as like somebody who thinks that they're already better than you are because, you know, white supremacy. So I think there's things that we can do, and also, you know, mental health and physical health and all of that. I'm never excited about, you know, bringing in people into those spaces. Mars?
Yeah, I have pretty similar feelings. I'm looking at this question: how can philanthropy and development spaces encourage more Black and brown people to come into the field? And I'm like, should the field be encouraging Black and brown people to come in? Because what I've seen is so many Black and brown folks come in and then leave after a couple of years, and they're just like, for lack of a better word, just traumatized by the experiences. And then they're like, I never want to do philanthropy, or I never want to do development again. So I'm like, what's the point in bringing them in if they're just going to leave the sector, and this is how they're leaving the sector? So similar to what Eric and Mano said, it is going to take a lot of internal culture shifts. And I think specifically thinking about if as an org you're ready to do things in a new way, because if you just want to hire a Black or brown person, okay, but they're not going to stay in your organization. Many folks aren't really trying to stay in the organization if you're trying to keep the status quo. And I also think there's a question around which Black and brown folks are being hired into these orgs, because it's usually the ones that are much more palatable. I only ever read that word, so this is me saying it out loud. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Thank you, Mano. Thanks for the thumbs up. The Black and brown folks who are more palatable to white folks, and they feel less threatened by them. So I also think there's this other issue of like not just hiring Black and brown folks, but are you actually hiring the Black and brown folks that are closest to the issues and even most impacted? Not every Black and brown person is, you know, impacted by, you know, the criminal justice system or the immigration system. So people really have to think about what expertise they want folks to bring in. And the last thing I'll say is that I feel like sometimes orgs think because they hired they have Black or brown people on staff, or they hired a Black or brown person, they're doing equity work, but you just hired someone. That's just diversity. That's just step one. And even that is very basic level. There's still equity and inclusion are a whole different level. So I'll end there. I don't think I answered the question because I said, just don't hire them because you're not ready. But Silvia.
I think you did a great job. I agree. I'm gonna yes. I feel like as the last one, my role has been yes and to all of this. So I'm gonna yes and it again. So for me, I think it's so much about changing the language as well, right? So everything that everyone has said, and also there's this belief of you know, if I can give $5,000, then that's who you should pursue. And I really believe that the person that gives $5 is just as important as the person that gives 5,000. And as someone who comes from the Latina community, I'm going to say that, you know, growing up, we were all fundraisers, right? We all saw when somebody was struggling, we would have a community dinner, or, you know, we would, if we had to share a meal, we would share a meal when someone maybe lost their job. And we constantly did this, but we believe, and Erika kind of touched on this, that it's the white woman in that role that's the philanthropist. And we don't see all the things that we have done in order to be philanthropists and fundraisers throughout our lives. And so I think that's also important to acknowledge. I think a lot of us you know, don't realize all the ways that we have helped and been donors or given to community. And so I just really believe that it's a change of language, of acknowledging that, you know, if what you give is what's important, and that's all that matters. And if all you can give is your time, and then that's great too, you know, and that's as important. We all need volunteers as much as we also need the money. So for me, it's a really big cultural change in that way as well. We need to change that narrative of, you know, we're only going to take that one person out to dinner who can give us that, you know, $500,000 or $5,000, and acknowledge that everyone deserves to know what your organization is doing. And again, it's a communication thing of getting everyone out there and really seeing your work, so then they can help you however they can. And it's all as important. And then as we see that, we all grow into this, oh yeah, fundraising is that car wash I did, or that, and then it doesn't feel so scary and this new world.
Wow, I just want to pull I just want quotes of all of that, and I want everyone's quotes in my house, and I want it immediately. Before I kind of say some things that I noticed and start to wrap us up, did anyone want to give a response to anything else, to anything a panelist said? Another panelist said? Yeah, Erika.
Oh, this was also great. And I appreciate you all reframing the question or changing the question, because I completely agree that not all orgs should or are ready to try to encourage Black and Brown people to join them. That's the reason I became a consultant, to be honest with you. And I think that happens a lot, is I went into 2 specific orgs. I wrote about this for the CCF blog and I was advocating for change and was either fired or had to leave on really bad terms. Because those orgs weren't ready for that. They weren't ready for somebody to challenge the status quo, or even they said they were, but were really not. And took me a lot of therapy and a lot of, you know, reevaluating my own self-worth, like feeling like all I could do was volunteer because no one was going to pay me to be a change maker, to then realize that, like, actually, there is this weird thing in nonprofits where they don't listen to people that they hire, and they only want to listen to people who are external. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll be a consultant. I never really wanted to start my own business or do that. I would much rather work for an organization, have them give me healthcare and make changes from the inside, because you know so intimately what's going on. But that is something weird that orgs just do not like to listen, or they say they do and they just will not listen to the folks internally. They want to pay a consultant to come in, listen, and then regurgitate and then be like, this is what we heard. And they're like, what? We've never heard that. Yes, you have. So I don't know how to fix that. But I think what we have going on is going to continually, just like Black and Brown folks are going to join, they're going to be pushed out, they're going to be traumatized, and then maybe become consultants. I don't know, or do something else.
Yeah, thank you, Erika. Does anyone else have something that they want to add? Mano, Maris, Silvia? No? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Erika, for kind of bringing that back. I know for sure this was the conversation we had, not one that I mistakenly had with Maris, but about, you know, people, and I think this kind of connects to a question you were answering earlier, or maybe it was this question of saying like, oh, like we want to hire, the VP of diversity or whatever and inclusion, but are you going to listen to them? That's the question. And when a lot of these organizations want to hire folks, they don't listen to them and then end up needing to have consultants to run their like race and equity trainings and all these things. And I, again, cannot remember who said this, but I know that one of you did and was talking about how it's also not okay to just hire Black and Brown people for a job and then expect that on the side of their entire job, they'll do the race and equity training for your whole organization. And I don't know if someone remembers saying this and wants to pop off on it real quick, but I just thought that was a really important piece of that sometimes these organizations hire Black and Brown people, and it's not part of their job description that they'll do race and equity training, but it's expected. And so now on top of the like 2 jobs I was already folded into that one nonprofit job, they're also supposed to be like this facilitator of racial justice when a lot of the times they're the one being impacted by it. And I just thought that was a super important piece. Yeah, so I think it's a very complex question. I appreciate everyone bringing, just so many thoughts. And I think with this question and this panel overall, a lot of these things could have a whole webinar series just about that, just about wealth hoarding and how that impacts BIPOC communities, just about how we hire Black and Brown folks into philanthropy. These are a whole series. And Maris had asked me at the beginning, kind of like, what's our intention with this panel? And like I said to her, and like I'll say to all of you, the intention is not that we come away with like a fixed idea of, oh, now that Erika said this thing about how we hire Black and Brown people, like that's my model and that's the only way to do this. And moving forward, I'm gonna take that as the gospel, but really to showcase that there are many different paths. There are many different ways to have frameworks around these questions. And so the idea here is just to get us all thinking, and also that these conversations will lead to action. I know Silvia is also a fan of this person, but Erika Hart, who's an educator and activist, I know that when this is before the pandemic, when she would have like speaking events, she would ask people to put away their pens and papers, because she was like, what keeps happening is that people come, you guys are taking all these notes, so you're leaving with really woke notebooks. And I'm like, your notebooks are great, but your thought process hasn't changed at all. Your actions haven't changed at all. So the hope with this Reimagining Philanthropy series with these kinds of conversations is that it will inspire us to think more deeply about how that impacts our work, and that will lead to us making changes in our organizations and in our fields. So I just wanted to say that we are at time. So I just want to thank our panelists so much for coming. It's been really amazing. And I think for me, and I'm sure for a lot of the viewers, here on the Zoom, on the live stream, and then watching the recording after, we could hear all of you talk for hours. And I hope that we do get to hear you talk much more, but I really appreciate you being here. And were there any last things that folks wanted to say or plug before we start to close out? Amazing, yeah. Okay, great. And I know that in, Zoom COVID times, it's a really big shift. Like we just all log off and then we're in our own rooms and it's kind of over. So just want to name that, but I really appreciate everyone being here. Thank you so much to our panelists again. Thank you so much to everyone who came and attended. And we look forward to seeing you at another Reimagining Philanthropy session. And always feel free to visit the Powerful Voices website to donate and to learn more about upcoming events. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Aisha. Great job moderating and prepping us for this. Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks, Aisha, and thanks, Win, on the backside.